Welcome to DEIJ Hot Takes. My name is Daryl Sinclair, and this is the podcast where we discover the bold and transformative ideas shaping diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work today. In this episode, we are joined by Sheena Mason, who is the co-founder of the Togetherness Wayfinder and an assistant professor at SUNY, specializing in Africana literature. You may know her from her books, The Raceless Anti-Racist and The Theory of Racelessness. Sheena, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Could you please share with us the DEIJ hot take that guides your work?
My central thesis and hot take is that to end racism, we have to undo our belief in race and our practice of assigning races to the human species.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about race, the most pervasive fiction that we've all currently read. Would you be able to take us through what this means in the context of DEIJ work, why you feel this is a hot take, and how you actually address this in the work that you do?
Let me start with why I know this is a hot take. The nature of my study has shown me that alternative views of race, alternative philosophies of race, continue to be silenced, marginalized, and excluded from classrooms, from media. And when they do pop up, although very rare because we are taught not to think about race in the ways I just named, when they do pop up, they're commonly misunderstood. And again, the cycle of silencing and marginalization and exclusion happens. Now, where I see this fitting in and impacting anything related to DEI SJ work is that, to my mind, as somebody who's advocating for equity and social justice, I'm interested in effective ways, effective methods of achieving the expressed goal, particularly ending racism and especially anti-Black racism. And when you look at the history of liberation movements, human rights movements in the places like the United States, for example, you see the tendency to fight against racism, to be anti-racist, is to reconstruct or reform what people think race is, usually by reconstructing or reforming the category of Blackness in particular. And although that reconstructive effort has taken us certainly further than we were 4 centuries ago, it has taken us as far as we can because the primary ideology that comes behind the very language of race and the practice of assigning races to the single human species is the dehumanizing apparatus that gets carried through the language of race and the belief in race. So to my mind, that means that to effectively do DEI SJ work, to effectively be anti-racist, we have to identify race for what it is, and we have to abolish it.
These are very powerful and quite complex topics here. So of course we're just doing an introductory jump in, but I will speak to the conversation we were having just before and identifying how I loved what you said, where you mentioned that the creation of the illusion of race in of itself was an act of racism. It was there created in order to separate and define people in ways in which they could be exploited and all the terrible things which have taken place within that illusionary construct. But at this point in time, in the modern day, when you approach your work moving towards the abolishment of race, do you ever face any shock or challenge to that from people who may, or communities who may have for themselves invested a lot or very much identify with their race as their primary identifier? What have you seen in that sense, and how do you approach it?
Thank you for that question. So certainly white supremacists would find my hot take problematic and disrupting how they see themselves, the centrality of race there in their so-called whiteness. But also there are people who are persistently and pervasively victimized by the problem of racism, usually anti-Black racism,
Mhm.
that have also witnessed the attempt to reconstruct race through the reconstruction of Blackness, to also include and mean and reflect everything positive a person can say about themselves as well. And in that sense, there are people who get racialized as Black, but also people who don't get racialized as Black, might get racialized as white, who see that in the abolition of the belief in race and the practice of assigning races, that there's also this abolition of everything positive that we could talk about as it relates to the category of Blackness.
Mhm.
And a necessary tool and part of the framework that I offer in the Raceless Anti-Racist is what I call the Racelessness translator, which helps people meaningfully translate what presents or is presumed to be race into something like culture, ethnicity, social or economic class, racism itself, or some combination thereof. And it's my contention that with that proper translation, we can start to free ourselves from what we view and practice as the positive aspects of our lives versus the pernicious nature of the belief in race and the practice of assigning races to humans.
I mean, what you're describing there sounds very liberating. But of course, with liberation comes fear of the loss of the comfort of the previous, dare I say, shackles that you had. In the same way, we have all of these pernicious negative stereotypes. There are some positive ones which people use to gain access to certain elements of their life and privileges that they have. So yes, the method of translating that I think should be very useful to many of our listeners. And moving on with that topic, just briefly, um, would you see there to be any potential for us to end up in the same situation if the current use of race was translated into things such as social class, economic capital, social capital, and other identifiers? Is there a danger that those labels, although they are tangible, would be just as pernicious in their use? Because here in Europe, we have a very distinct culture of class, which presents many problems. So, what are your thoughts about using those labels arguably in place of what people believe is race?
That's an excellent question. In the Raceless Anti-Racist, my book that's forthcoming, I actually make the argument that we have to define racism through recognizing that the components of racism require the belief in race and the practice of assigning races to humans in order to reflect and maintain a desired economic and social hierarchy. So that when I actually talk about social and economic class in places like the United States, there is or can be overlap between race and class, right? That's why, to some people's minds, when we talk about the category of Blackness in the US, people interpret that as like poor, right? That we're talking about poor people, we're talking about urban people. We do these kinds of collapsing and conflating all the time. But in being infinitely more clear-eyed about not just what racism is in theory and in practice, but also what these other categories are, what actually results is a more proliferated understanding of oneself, a more proliferated understanding and a more real understanding of one's context. And I think also arguably a stronger desire to make positive changes, not just for oneself, but also for one's community, which is something that we're lacking in terms of our current methodology. Our current methodology, you don't have to look very far to see that most people are feeling that things are more divided today than ever, right? That the problems that haunt us are more pervasive than ever. And at minimum, the risk of trying something new is nothing when compared with the madness, as Einstein would call it, of doing what we've done always and expecting a different result. And so while there's certainly fear in the unknown, while there's certainly danger of trying the unknown, and while humans do have a unique propensity for dividing along what should otherwise be superficial lines, um, if nothing else, we would have a clearer view of our realities, which I think is always a good thing. I don't know about anyone else, but I don't prefer to live in a matrix. So, if what happens at the end of the day is this act of translation and all of that, and then we recognize, oh, well, we still have these other thoroughly pernicious ways that we harm people, that we dehumanize people, my view is that we can then better address those problems more meaningfully, and that we should, but that just because those problems are going to still exist or persist doesn't mean we shouldn't try to solve these other problems over here.
I think that's really excellent, and I really enjoy it because I am also a firm believer that in in creating change or in stimulating change, you provide a wealth of unseen and unknowable until you're doing it changes which provide opportunity for other improvements. So just
That's right.
change in of itself, to a degree, it needs to be intentional, it needs to be thoughtful, but change in of itself may lead you to still a better situation, even if it wasn't the situation you originally envisioned. But with all of that being said, at the end of each episode, I like to just ask for what would be your key takeaway. It could be a resource, it could be your book, or just a reflective question that people can take away from listening to you and maybe immediately begin applying to how they're approaching their work or their day.
Thank you. You can find more information at togethernesswayfinder.org, where you can also access my forthcoming book, The Raceless Anti-Racist. And the questions I would like to leave you with are, what is race and what should we do with it? Those are the questions of the day.
Excellent questions, and hopefully we have some people reaching out. Thank you so much for a thoughtful discussion. For our listeners, I'll place all the links you've mentioned in the description below and how they can connect with you and explore your ideas and work. Thank you for watching or listening, and I will see you on the next episode of DEIJ Hot Takes. Thank you so much, Sheena.
Thank you. Bye-bye.